respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any other elders who might be joining us today. We recognise that there are many traditional owners caring for country, including weed management and fire management activities, and some of these practices play a key role in continuing their culture. I'd like to welcome you today on behalf of myself, Kate Blood, my colleague Bianca Gold, based at Horsham, and our many collaborators. Bianca and I are part of the Weeds at the Early Stage of Invasion team in the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. We're hosting through the statewide Integrated Flora and Fauna teams, or SWIFT website, and want to thank SWIFT for supporting this webinar series. They've been fantastic. We're also proud members of the Weed Society of Victoria, another one of our many collaborators. Our tech support today is provided by Matt Bliss from Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, or DELP. Thanks, Matt. And we'll be acknowledging our collaborators in our logos and throughout the webinar series. So thank you to them and the speakers for joining us today. For those of you who have not logged into the previous webinars in this series, it takes a lot of people to put on a production such as this, so we'd just like to acknowledge a few of the people who've been supporting us. Andrew Geschke from DELP, Connecting Communities program, for great support on the images and the connecting slides and that kind of thing, and some of the early tech. Also the many regional staff from DELP's Natural Environment program and also from Forest Fire and Regions group. Mal Corrie from DELP's Weeds and Pests on Public Land program. Thank you, Mal, for supporting the WESI project. Our Parks Victoria colleagues and also our supervisor, Stefan Kaiser. Thank you very much. The webinars cover different aspects of weed management after fire, so there's a different theme each week. And this week, it's all about collaboration. Now, many of the pieces of information that are being shared with you are relevant for planned burns as well as wildfires, so just keep that in mind, although planned burning may not be mentioned very often. Across the series so far, we've had over 1,400 registrations from all around the world, which is very pleasing to see so much interest in this topic. If you're using social media today, we're using the hashtag WeedFireWebinars. If you'd like to tag us or follow us through our feeds, which will happen over in the chat part of the presentation, it'd be great to have you along. If you have any questions or comments today, please use the chat. At the end of each presentation, we'll be reading the questions out to get the presenter to address those. If you're viewing us through YouTube, through the live stream today, you will see an email address periodically appearing on your screen, and you can send questions to that email address. All the chats and links and so on will be made available through the SWIFT website, along with the recording of the webinar today in coming days. We've got 4 presentations today, and we'll be finishing by 12:15. Now, most importantly, these webinars have been made possible by funding from the Victorian Government's $22.5 million Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery Program. The abbreviation is BBRR, and you might be hearing that abbreviation a bit during the webinar. So that's for Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery Program. Big supporters of this webinar. We couldn't have done it without them. So for those of you who were watching last week, we had some audio issues with Steve Taylor's presentation, and I just wanted to let you know that on the SWIFT website, we'll be putting a link soon for another presentation that you can watch for Steve, just to learn more about what he does if you weren't able to hear the presentation last week. So the theme for today, as I mentioned, is all about collaboration and how we work together to achieve more. And the first two presenters today are from Parks Victoria. It's great to have Parks Victoria on board as one of our collaborators for these webinars. And we've got two very experienced weed practitioners today sharing their vast knowledge and what they've learned, particularly from the last bushfire season. So our first speaker today is Keith Primrose. Keith is based in the beautiful Mount Beauty area in northeast Victoria, and Keith's presentation is about working together to help biodiversity recover after fire. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Kate. Just take a couple of seconds to sort out my technology. So I will start by also recognising the traditional owners on the land on which I am today, which is I'm actually in Bright on the Ovens River, which is Tanarong country. Now, could you maybe let me know, Kate, if you can see my screen okay?
I can, thank you, Keith.
No worries. So thanks everybody for attending today. So my name's Keith Primrose, as Kate mentioned. So my substantive role, I'm the Environment Coordinator for Parks Victoria's Eastern Victoria region, which spans all of the managed parks and reserve between Tallangatta and Wilson's Prom. So it's quite a large tract of land, and last year a large portion of that across northeastern Victoria and East Gippsland was burnt through the 2020 fires. So I'm going to talk specifically about how we collaborated with our partners and other agencies sort of a little bit during and immediately following the fires to develop an integrated pest, plant and animal program across the parks. So I know obviously this is a web series about weed management, but largely within the footprint, particularly following fire, but in general, we tend to try to manage our pest species in an integrated fashion, as there's a fair few sort of interrelationships, which I'll talk about a little bit today. So just a really brief overview. You might have seen some of this stuff in the past, but last year's fires, we had 425,000 hectares of parks and reserves impacted, and of those 285,000 were impacted is a high severity. So that's a lot of parks and reserves had between 90% and 100% of their land was burnt. So there's a number of really large parks, and you can see the red polygon on this this slide, which the entire parks had been burnt. So there's a lot of stats on what was impacted, and I've got a little citation below that you probably have heard of before, the Bushfire Biodiversity Response and Recovery Report put out by DELP. So that there's a lot of stats on the various species and communities that have been impacted. So just a really brief one, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just wanted to talk really briefly about how invasive, how invasive species impact after fire and how they interact. So the weeds are often the early colonizers after fire, and particularly in areas where there have been high severity fires, the weed species can be the first to colonize and also very vigorous colonizers. So things, particularly at the moment, we're seeing big influxes of things like blackberries on wet areas and river courses, but following that we also get things like brooms and all of your early things like thistles and your more herbaceous species. And what these things can do is outcompete the native species that tend to be often a bit slower to return. So they can alter the habitat composition and structure, as well as basically outcompete and not allow the space for native species to regenerate in their due time. Now, these species can also alter the hydrology and ecosystem function by, changing that structure and composition. The other thing that we've been finding, which has made it more challenging this year, because there are really large tracts of land which are completely burnt, like really severely burnt, and there is no native vegetation remaining, and the weeds are the only vegetation and structure providing any habitat. So we're faced with the difficult situation where we actually need to weigh up the benefits of controlling the weeds in the immediate term to prevent them from establishing and outcompeting native vegetation. But those same weeds are the only habitat for threatened species, where if we were to remove those, we would actually remove the last breeding and foraging habitat for those species. And we've got a number of examples of threatened frog species which are currently harbouring within weeds. So we actually are in a difficult situation of needing to leave the weeds behind. So herbivores, and here we're largely talking about deer, so introduced deer species, and particularly sambar, but we also have impacts by feral cattle, goats, pigs. So they impact by grazing and browsing directly on the vegetation. They also root, like pigs root in the ground and dig up, tubers and invertebrates, etc. They also disturb the ground by the impacts of trampling, pugging, wallowing, preaching, thrashing, all these different types of activities which directly impact on regenerating vegetation. They also spread weeds and create disturbance, which improves the opportunities for weeds to establish. And they can influence predation by creating tracks and maintaining those open vegetation types, which allow easier movement of predator species to move through the landscape, and also reduce the amount of harbour available for prey species like critical weight range mammals, reptiles and others. So it makes them more susceptible to predation. And then your predators, they have a really good or improved opportunity for predation following fire because of those reasons, that there's less shelter, there's easier travel, and they can get around the landscape to provide further pressures on those species which are already impacted by lack of foraging habitat, lack of food sources, etc. So in the beginning, whilst the fires were still going on, we started to work out how to prioritise those activities. Now, you likely heard some of the early work through previous presentations in prioritising, so I won't go into too much detail. I know that Damien McMasters gave a presentation earlier, which I think would have covered a lot of that material. So in the initial stages, there was a couple of the sort of expert workshops, which included a number of different sort of species experts, landscape experts, scientists, land managers, all getting together to work out where we would prioritise activities, or where best to start the recovery process, both during the fire and the emergency response and immediately following. So that then led to a variety of fund sources, which we'll talk about. But I just wanted to mention here just the breadth of information that we incorporated in those early stages. So including the reports that came from that expert elicitation, utilising modelling through the strategic management prospects and other nature kit products. There are, for those of you that aren't aware, there are what's called the bushfire rapid risk assessment teams that occur during the bushfire emergency response. So there's a teams of experts that are embedded within the emergency management teams, the incident management teams, to actually work on early analysis of recovery activities, and they produce these BRATS reports, which are localised reports on immediate actions. We also have a variety of other listings and action statements, recovery plans, etc., related to specific species that are at risk. We have local plans, so strategic documents that might be relative to particular threats, species, or landscapes. So we've got a couple of examples there of, English broom management plans, pig plans, coastal biodiversity threat management plans. And then we have a variety of data, which is both data on species and communities managed through VBA and those sort of statewide data sets, as well as localized data based on management observations and existing programs prior to the fires. So what to do with all of this information? So I guess an immediate catalyst was the BBR Fire Recovery Initiative funding that Kate mentioned earlier, and Damien would have spoken about in other presentations. But it was really a catalyst for us to say, okay, well, we've got all of this broad scale landscape sort of priorities. We know where the assets are and what those threats are. We have some idea on where the priority actions were based on the statewide reports and our existing information. So how do we actually turn that into a program on ground? So in the immediate term, what we did is we held some collaborative prioritization workshops. And, it's great to have all of these really clever tools and modeling and different information technology platforms. But I'm a strong advocate for when it comes to planning what happens on ground, those tools influence and feed into our knowledge base, but really the most useful way of working on it is to roll the maps out, get together and actually draw on maps and actually brainstorm in hard copy and really feed off each other's experience and knowledge on ground. So this was actually in the beginning of COVID, before we'd had a lockdown. So we were able to actually have those meetings in Gippsland in the northeast. Here is a selection of the key partners, but in particular, lots of input from various elements of DELP and Parks Victoria, important collaborations with Trust for Nature, and looking at how to have complementary works in neighbouring properties. We had researchers, and in particular, I've just mentioned one in particular, the La Trobe Research Centre for Applied Alpine Ecology, but there were several research organisations that provided input onto the on-ground works. Important contributions from Landcare Australia, both for neighbouring but also community interest within specific landscapes. The CMAs in the northeast and East Gippsland, HVP, because a lot of this landscape are important linkages through forestry. And of course, the Arthur Riley Institute, which provided some of that really critical on-ground information or known information, but also intelligence gathering to influence our activities. So what we took from that is basically from all those scribblings and those brain dumps, we came up with a series of actions for which we developed, spatially explicit parameters for those activities, and then built a program around what we would do in those areas. So I thought I had presented, I'm missing a slide here, but what some of those activities were things like particularly weed control, both in riparian areas, wet areas, localized habitats, like a specific sort of species-related weed control, as well as more of those biosecurity type actions to influence emergence, like the emerging species. A lot of looking at herbivore control across the landscape in strategic areas to protect those specific habitats and communities that are susceptible immediately after fire. And then, of course, predation, which is particularly focused on species, critical weight range species and their habitats, which we know are either directly influenced by fire or influenced by extension on nearby burnt habitats, influencing the sort of predator responses. So from that point, we mentioned earlier the statewide funding, which was a really amazing achievement and amazing contribution to fire recovery activities across the landscape. But obviously, there's a bit of a mobilisation process for that to become available. There was also a variety of other fund sources which were immediately or early released funding, so federal funding particularly, but also other catchment management funding. There was funding through the Zoos Victoria for specific species actions, and community grants available through DELP and Bushfire Recovery Victoria. So all of those things were in the works and were available, but we needed to also do some initial works on the spot. So there were things that were able to happen through the emergency response, and you might have heard about those in other presentations. But a big one was obviously aerial control of herbivores in that burnt landscape, but also some extractive type rescue activities of specific species, as well as some early intelligence gathering. But immediately following the fires, and in some cases whilst there was still fire occurring, there was a need for us to attack particularly those early emerging species like the blackberries and thistles and things that were actually coming up in that burnt landscape within the same season, before we had sort of any of this response money available. So in those cases, we actually reprioritised existing funding opportunities across the landscape to allow us to tackle those in the emergent stages. So I just wanted to talk briefly about a case study, and sorry, Kate and Goldie, I actually have no idea how I'm tracking for time, but I just wanted to talk about the Pheasant Creek Flora and Fauna Reserve. Now, this is a really important reserve. There's a map of it in the image down the bottom. It's a really small reserve which has really important habitats, communities, and endemic species within it. So it's surrounded by forestry, by pine plantations, and feeder creeks of I think they're called custodianship habitats that are managed by HVP. So it's got what I think is considered to be the lowest of alpine peatlands, so subalpine peatland communities. It also has important wetland systems and endemic species which are found nowhere else well, anywhere. Some of those species, they're only restricted to this landscape. So it's impacted by particularly herbivores and weeds. There's a lot of interest from the local community in this area, as well as researchers and other government agencies. So what we did is we looked at it as a whole as to how we would manage that in an integrated fashion. So the Landcare had put in a lot of pre-work. So they have engaged consultants to develop pest management plans and undertake biodiversity surveys and threat surveys. One key driver, the local Landcare group, one of their key activities that they were seeking was to fence it from deer. So we actually sought funding to fence the wetland communities, which is a small yellow polygon you can see in the map, and protect that from deer, but make a partial exclusion fence, which will still allow movement of native herbivores. We're undertaking both sort of broader weed control for the the larger scale species on roadsides, but also some really localized and delicate weed control within those threatened species community. And so you can see these little emergent blackberries which are popping up in that wetland, and that is which they're everywhere, and it involves a really delicate touch not to impact on the values. And the other one is just sort of more broad scale herbivore control. We talked a little bit about, we're undertaking landscape scale control through aerial and ground shooting, but we've also partnered with HVP, who are undertaking herbivore control within the pine plantations, for them to expand their control into the reserve, so providing resources to allow them to come once or twice a month and specifically target this reserve and ensure that we're reducing the pressure on the broader reserve and also limiting the pressure which will be on the fence. So you might have heard someone's Kate or Goldie spruiking earlier that at another time that we do have the national or the Australasia Weed Conference occurring next year, and just as a bit of a plug, we will be having a site visit as part of the field trips to this site to talk about this in more detail if you're interested in seeing it firsthand. Thanks, Kate. That's pretty close as I can get to keeping to time, I reckon.
Thanks very much, Keith. Well done. Very interesting presentation. I really agree with you about using paper maps and butcher's paper and marker pens for those really productive planning processes. Really good. Now I'm going to, Keith, combine your question time with Deirdre's, so we'll keep moving and move into our next presentation. So our second presenter from Parks Victoria this morning is Deirdre Griepsma, and Deirdre is the Regional Biodiversity Recovery Program Coordinator based down at the sensationally beautiful Inverloch on the coast. Deirdre today is talking about collaboration for biodiversity recovery. So over to you, Deirdre.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I hope you can see my slides on the screen.
We could.
Yep. Are they there?
We can see you now.
Oh,
there we go.
Okay,
we can see them now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Kate. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on, past, present and emerging. I'm on Bunurong land, and as Kate indicated, that's Inverloch. For those who aren't sure, it's the southern coastline of Victoria, and that's one of the benefits working from home has brought to us this year. So yeah, today I'm going to have a quick chat with you about successful delivery of bushfire recovery programs, and they require a lot of coordination. Our invasive species don't recognise boundaries, but we do. So how do we make sure that we're working together to combat the invasive species, particularly after a devastating effect on our biodiversity like the 1920 bushfires have had? So I want to have a chat with you about how Parks Victoria have worked with a range of partners and stakeholders. We've developed really solid relationships, and how this has provided a really good foundation for us to leverage into the future and move from what has been and is still an immediate reactive threat management for our biodiversity to a restorative focus across the fire impacted landscape in Eastern Victoria. Kate described my role before. Essentially what it is I am coordinating the delivery of the funding through Parks Victoria for the bushfire recovery efforts. So it's not so much the on-ground work, but it's very much about trying to coordinate our great staff and across the districts to deliver the projects and in our regional operations team. So Keith has run through with you a bit of the background, and this map is just another version of the one he showed you, but the grey areas obviously show you the fire footprint when it was reassessed after the fires. 1.5 million hectares of fire in the area, and about a third of that was Parks managed estate. So we've got a big task ahead of us, and one of the things that we've learnt really quickly is that we can't do this alone, hence the collaboration that comes in. A couple of stats you'll be seeing in front of you, and again I'd like to acknowledge the state government DELP report, the Victoria's Bushfire Emergency Biodiversity Response and Recovery version 2, which came out in August this year. It can be found on DELP's website for those who are keen to go and have a look at more of those figures and the species lists that are within that. We also had a range of different effects on particularly our national parks. Burra Mountain Pine National Park, which is up in this northeast area of Victoria, that was 100% burnt. So nearly 19,000 hectares in that area that received a really severe scorching as well. But then we also have parks that are down in this area, which is the Erranundra plateau, where we had 2/3 of the park burnt. So we're dealing with some different types of habitat that is recovering. We've also got some refugia areas, which is, as Keith said, where we're finding some of our native species seeking that refuge while the natural habitat they'd normally live in is recovering. So Keith's given you a good idea of what happened immediately after the fires and the planning that went in. So when we got to around June, July this year, what we found we had was really good relationships, a lot of incredible goodwill out of organisations, agencies, private and public, that allowed us to keep moving and start to put some of that planning into effect. We had established roles and we also did recruitment. I only started in this role in July this year, so that was also dependent on the funding agreements coming through, which again happened very quickly. So the state government did a fantastic job. DELP got moving very quickly to get that money flowing through to organisations so that we could start doing works on ground. We had a lot of local knowledge. Our parks rangers who had worked in this area, the local community, also officers out of other organisations who had worked in the East Gippsland area and the northeast for a long time, and they had some really good local knowledge that wasn't written down anywhere but was very valuable in conversations and how we could move forward. Had lots of good foundation documents, which you'll see in the images in front of you, and these ones were developed between when the fire we're still going. The first one came out in January through to August, and there's a number of others, not just what you're looking at there. But what we also had was a scarred and burnt landscape. So that sort of led us into a few challenges, and what we learnt together about these challenges again leads into that collaborative approach that we had to take. Information is just a snapshot in time. We needed to keep learning. We needed to keep looking at what was going on around us, and not just sort of what we had seen yesterday, but what we were seeing today and what we might see tomorrow. Weeds are seasonal. That's you know, something that you all know, I know, and we need to keep working with that. We had situations like in Buchan, which some people might know, the Buchan Caves in the East Gippsland area. That area flooded 5 times from the times the fires finished, which was February, March, through to around July. So we had erosion events to deal with. When we got in there to do some work, we then found we had big rainfall events come through as well. So this is where we had to keep learning. One of the big things that we had was we had one landscape, but we had a lot of activity by a lot of the organisations you'll see in the image there, and it did become a bit of where's Wally. We'd be going out wanting to do some ground shooting to find that we had other people in the area that we wanted to work in. They were doing their work and trying to deliver their programs, which were just as critical and important as what ours were. We also had a challenging environment, both physically, socially, psychologically, and financially. Having a whole bucket of money thrown at you is fabulous, but it needs to be dealt with in a really planned way. So what did we then do? The partners then scattered. We had to go and deal with our own internal processes within our organisations, and that was a bit of a learning as well. We had a lot of similarities. We were all trying to achieve the same objective, but we had different internal processes which sometimes caused us delays. We got environmental access agreements in place. We also started our procurement of contractors, but again, different processes. So again, the number of people that were out trying to do work who'd received funding was fantastic. But it also caused us some problems in trying to coordinate activities and keep everyone's safety front of mind. We worked really closely with the traditional owners, the Gunai-Kurnai in the East Gippsland area in particular, and they helped us work with other owners, traditional owners in the landscape as well that were outside of their particular area but neighbouring. We also worked with the Tanarong and some of the other traditional owners in the northeast area. That was really crucial to make sure that we maintained our partnership agreements and learnt off that local knowledge too. We also had competing priorities with other business as usual and other projects. We had other tied funding projects where we had to keep delivering. We had reporting deadlines to meet with our normal biodiversity improvement initiatives that we had. We had to deal with the expectations of both ourselves and what we could do in that time period, but also the communities, and both in Melbourne, because people were locked up in COVID regulation conditions, which meant they couldn't come down to the fire footprint and see what was actually happening on the ground. They were reliant on the communication that will come back, and it was very hard sometimes to explain what we were looking at and what we were having to deal with. The caution note on the bottom there, some people might have heard this saying before, don't eat the elephant whole. It's a big task what we've taken on, and it will continue for many years, and you have to approach it in a really collaborative, coordinated, staged approach, and that's something we've been learning and we keep learning. So collaboration's the key. That's essentially what we have, what we've learnt out of this. We know that we've got shared knowledge, shared information, we built trust, we built support, and we work fabulously across all the organisations. We share our knowledge and we trust each other to be bringing to the table what we need to keep moving forward. We've got a big path ahead. We've got more funding that's been announced, and I did a quick tally and worked out that from the start of this financial year through to the end of next financial year, so through to the 30th of June 2022, which is a 2-year time frame, over $4.2 million will go into weed management, weed threat management in the fire footprint and the surrounding refugia area. So I think that's more money than weeds have had in a significant period of time, and even accumulatively. So we need to make sure that we're working together to get the best outcomes for our environment, but also for ourselves. We need to know that we're making a difference. We also are looking at exploring some tenure blind work as well, getting over those boundaries and hurdles that we've approached before. We need more collaboration. We need to keep working together. I'm going to have a quick look at a case study. I've got a couple of minutes, and so I'll just touch on this, and if you wanted to know more about it, you can ask some questions, or I can provide some more information. Some people will be familiar with littoral rainforests. They occur in Victoria along the East Gippsland coast predominantly. These are an EVC, a littoral rainforest and coastal vines and thickets of Eastern Victoria is their formal name. So quickly, what's happened is a lot of these littoral rainforest areas have been burnt. Particularly the ones that the red dots on the map you can see there that are east of the Orbost Marlow area, all along through to Mallacoota, Cape Howe and around this area. We've had in the past a littoral rainforest management plan, which was done in 2013, so it's 2014 to 19. It's been the Bible of how we've dealt with things with littoral rainforests and coastal vines and thickets. DELP commissioned this report, and which was done by a consultant, but we've all shared it as to the way to move forward with littoral rainforests. With these littoral rainforests being burnt, we now have a new, I guess, starting point as far as what we're going to do next, how we're going to manage these and how we're going to help them recover. So we're about to embark on a project where we update this report and we look at the 40 highest priority littoral rainforests as to how we manage the threats to them and how we manage the regeneration of them moving forward, which require intervention and which are doing quite well. All the logos you can see at the bottom here are the partner agencies that we're going to have to work with. Parks Victoria have the funding for this program through the RLP, so we're very appreciative of that. We can also put some BBRR money with that. We can collaborate the funding to get the best outcomes. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. These are what littoral rainforests look like before they're burnt. These are two examples at before and after. This one here is at Wingan Inlet, which is East Gippsland, and this one is the Cape Coron area, and these photos were taken yesterday, so you can see some emergence of the understory, but we also know we have weeds in there that are competing. This one was at Cape Coron, which was in a better state than what I thought we might have found it, which is really encouraging. There's particular species that make up littoral rainforests, which I won't go into because there are people who know that far more than I do. But again, these photos give you an idea of the types of ground that we're looking at the moment. And this one in particular is an emergent weed. You've got the dicolysis P that comes through as well. This is a olive berry, which is what you would hope to find in a littoral rainforest. There was also lots of young banksias and other plants that come through. But I'll leave it there, and Kate, we could move into questions.
Thanks, Deirdre. Very interesting presentation, and so good to have slides, images from the field that you know were just taken yesterday. That's fabulous. Deirdre, we're going to keep moving as we're just on time, so people can address questions to you in the chat and you can answer them there. But thank you very much for your presentation today. Our next presentation is by Callum Walker from Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. During the Black Saturday fires in February 2009, a fire burnt a large area near Bendigo, and the recovery response that resulted was a well-coordinated success story of collaboration between multiple agencies and the community. So it's really great to have Callum here today talking about the experience that he had and getting him to share his knowledge and what he learnt. There is a report that that Callum and a colleague produced about the work that they did during that time, and we're hoping to have a PDF of the report available on the SWIFT's website in coming days. So hopefully that will be available to you in the near future. So Callum, thank you very much for joining us today. Over to you.
Thanks, Kate. Just to check that you can see my screen.
We could. You might just want to share that again.
Okay, try again. How about now?
There we go. Excellent. Thanks, Callum.
Thank you. As others have said, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on country that has been inhabited by Indigenous people for many thousands of years. In my particular case, I'm sitting on Djadjurrung country. We have a very good relationship with the Djadjurrung nowadays, who have entered into the first recognition and settlement agreement, which involves the Crown Land Estate. As Kate said, I'm Callum Walker. My title doesn't really mean anything. I'm the project manager for Land and Built Environment. The work that I do involves the Loddon Mallee region between just out of Melbourne in Macedon Ranges all the way through to Mildura up in the northwest corner of the state. My role is to manage Crown land that is not managed by other agencies, so unreserved Crown land in particular, public safety works and pest plant animal works, and then revegetation and land improvement works. So I take you back to Black Saturday. So I remember Ash Wednesday in 1982 as being a really nasty day. There were dust storms and large fires, but in my experience, this was the dirtiest day for fire that I'd ever experienced. So this is a picture of Bendigo, and this is some of the event. Unlike the fires that have been described in the last two presentations, this is an urban landscape. It looks like it's not very well built up, and I'll come and talk to that in a minute. This shed in the bottom of the photo is Spotlight in Bendigo, and if people know Bendigo, that's probably about 1.5, 2 kilometres from the centre of town. So I was given the task to go out into the Crown land in suburban Bendigo, and the first tasks that I did were recovery tasks around making sure that dangerous trees were managed, and then I was asked to make application for some funding, and to do that I needed to understand a whole lot of things about what I was going to do. So I needed to understand the landscape in the first instance, understand the natural environment, know who the managers and the partners are. The community sentiment was essential to understanding what might need to be done. And then once funds were obtained, to go through to fulfil all statutory requirements, engage with the community and implement. And I'll go through a number of these throughout this presentation. So this is a picture of Bendigo. I'm going to come back to it and describe it more, but you can see that the landscape is relatively well vegetated. This photo was taken a couple of years ago, well after the fire. And look, I don't think I mentioned, but Black Saturday was the 7th of February 2009. So this is an aerial shot of the city of Bendigo. It was developed organically. It wasn't surveyed and laid out before the mining. The mining dictated where development occurred and where development couldn't occur. So currently it prides itself on being city in the forest, and you can see that surrounding the city, which is the greyer areas in the middle of the picture, are these darker brown areas, and that's all forest. So there's a large amount of forest surrounding the city, and it constrains the development quite markedly. In 2009, there were about 100,000 people in the city. So from Victoria's example, it's not a small town. It's the third largest city in the state. So a large regional city from our perspective. It's also a dry city, and so there's no water, there's no river running through it. This is the actual burn overlaid on top of the aerial photo. So you can see that it entered into the town coming from the northwest. And the paler colour pink is the original run of fire. And then when there was a wind change, that darker red colour is where it moved after the change to the southwesterly change. The interesting thing about the burn footprint is that the area burnt is nothing like what people have been describing in the east of the state last summer. But it's similar in that it was about half of it was Crown land. And because it's in an urban environment, we lost 58 houses. I think there were something like 129 individuals directly impacted through loss of fire, and there was one fellow who lost his life. So the environment now, it's interesting that Bendigo doesn't have any pristine natural landscape anymore. The entire forest all around the city for a day's walk away is completely denuded for the mining purposes. So the land, which may have looked something like the bottom photograph, which is, I think it's in the whipstick, it's got the dominant tree is Eucalyptus tricarpa, which is red ironbark. But the top photo is a typical piece of Crown land in Bendigo. So you can see that the comparison is huge compared with what it would have been like. And I like the description from someone at the time. They said the landscape is what one might suppose the earth would have appear after a day of judgment had emptied all of the graves. So the whole landscape is denuded and is pockmarked with mines, and so it's important to think like a landscape gardener rather than an ecologist when it comes to repairing land, improving land, because we're never going to achieve that pristine ecological vegetation class. These areas of land are highly used. There's an interesting statement in some of the land acts from around the world, and particularly from British colonial times. This one's the Victorian Land Act from 1862, produced by the British Parliament, and it talks about the wastelands of the Crown. And this goes back to the idea of common land in Europe and the UK, but it actually is still a prevalent thought around how people use the land in urban areas. So they think it is wasteland. It's for, you know, putting their rubbish on and parking their cars, and it's not considered nice land that should be kept for public amenity. So in this map, this is a map of pretty much the fire area. All of the pink and grey areas here are Crown land. All of the white is freehold land. So you can see that a large amount of land is Crown land. This here, I've circled what is generally burnt, but you can see it's the same map, but now it has a whole lot of different colours on it. So the different colours designate a different land manager. Some of the land is managed by Parks Victoria, some of it is licensed, some of it is managed by DELP, some of it is managed by Water Authority or the City of Greater Bendigo. And all of these people and agencies needed to be engaged before works could commence on these lands. So with that in context, I've come back to this picture because now I can say that this road, this little track on the left of the picture is Government Road. The land with the poppet head on is unreserved Crown land. The land in between the poppet head and the White House, there's a government road in there. It's also unreserved Crown land. The land on the horizon is state forest, managed by the forests part of the department. And so we have all of these different statuses of land, and then a whole lot of licenses as well. I'd like to talk briefly about the community. So the community were really quite traumatised by this fire, and in some instances, I think that that's still the case. And so it was really important to engage with the community to understand their sentiments, and those community, the way we approached the community was through community groups and councils, and also contractors in the community to support people who needed some funds after the fire as well. This is a list of partners, and it's not as pretty as the picture that DG presented, but you can see that we did involve as many people as we possibly could. This picture here is the Eaglehawk High School. I think it was a Year 9, Form 3 class, and they had a good time, a day off, and they planted, I think they planted 1,000 trees on that day. So I obtained funding of $350,000 from the Victorian Bushfire Reconstruction and Recovery Authority, so VIBRA. And after that, I needed to obtain a whole lot of statutory approvals. I needed to work with other land managers such as Parks Victoria and water authorities and council to get permission to work on their land. I also needed to talk to Aboriginal Affairs Victoria to see if I could undertake some work like ripping the land without impacting on Indigenous cultural heritage, and then organising machinery and contractors and seed and plants and things. So it was the planning part was involving a whole lot of people prior to actually commencing work. So the weed removal itself was done in several different ways. So we did it manually. A lot of volunteer groups. So there was Conservation Volunteers Australia, Mission Victoria. I can't remember. There were several volunteer groups, including local community, and they got out there with chainsaws and trailers and managed the weeds. We also did mechanical works. This, I think, is a contractor, although we do have one of these in our depot as well, a mechanical groomer. This was grinding out stumps of poplars, I think, at this one. We also did chemical removal. This was bridal creeper. And you can see that in some instances the chemical works are quite effective. But one of the things that we found as most effective is revegetation. So it crowds out the potential for weeds. You need to manage weeds underneath in between, but we also found out that Eucalyptus tricarpa, which is the red ironbark, is particularly good at crowding out weeds. And so we've been using this method into the future for trying to manage weeds on some of these blocks. There were some side benefits. So the fire exposed a whole lot of heritage that I didn't know was there because they were all covered with weeds. We had the opportunity to get in there to talk to neighbours and say, look, you need to remove all your encroachments. We found piles of rubbish, piles of tyres and that sort of stuff. And then it has increased the amenity value. And as I said, the crowding out with canopy species was a good side effect. So for those who like data, this is a list of species that we targeted. I won't go through them all, but just briefly that there are 35 genus, 40 species or more, 1 regionally prohibited species, which was bone seed, 14 regionally controlled species, and we delivered this work on 124 hectares of land. A little bit more data. This is the species we revegetated with. So you can see that there are a number of eucalyptus species, both mallee species and forest species. And overall there was 12,000 tube stock planted and more than 350 grams of seed. We use locally indigenous species, but it's important to keep on thinking like a landscape gardener. You can still use locally indigenous species, but you need to plant them to make it manageable into the future. So some ongoing benefits. So the removal of the weeds and the fire hazards created these partnerships, and those partnerships are still going. It's interesting that we worked out there's a 30-metre buffer is a key thing between these crownland vegetated areas of these crownland blocks and freehold land. That's for 2 reasons. Firstly, the height of the forest is about 30 metres around Bendigo, and so if trees fall over, they're not going to impact on private infrastructure. And also the radiant heat will, if a fire comes within 30 metres, radiant heat will make a house burn or timber burn. We also tried to do some planting with some fire tolerant species. I'm not sure that there is such a thing, but we tried to do the best we could with that. And we also found that and this is the landscape gardener coming out, is that planting in clumps is better than planting great swathes. It makes it easier. And that's it, Kate. The work goes on.
Thanks, Callum. Thanks for another fine example of people coming together to achieve a common outcome. There's a couple of questions. So one is it possible to send me the photo taken by the Eagle Hawk Secondary College or SC?
Yes, I don't know whether I can find the original. That one I took from the report, but yes, if you can take a name, yep. I'm happy for it to go somewhere else.
So that one's Dave Pastelenic, so he's within DELP. I can send you his.
I know Dave. Yep. All right.
There you go. Another question, could you apply this same type of response to a non-urban area, do you think?
I would suggest so, and Deirdre and Keith sort of mentioned this before, and I think that really they are doing the same sort of process that I did in Bendigo. It's just the number of partners may be a bit different, and the complexity of the landscape and the land status is different. So yeah, I don't see why you couldn't do this sort of thing. You might be looking to achieve a different outcome, so more of an ecological outcome than an amenity outcome. But yes, I don't see why you couldn't do this sort of process elsewhere.
Sure. And for those that are listening, we have posted a couple of links there to the report that Callum referred to. So that's available as a PDF on the Swift website. So another question for you, Callum, is there anything you would do differently if you were faced with the same type of recovery situation again? What lessons?
Yeah, so one of the big lessons I learned was that planning in time is important. Deirdre mentioned this briefly, but if you miss a season, then you've got a whole lot of work further to do. And it also is important because sponsors, funding bodies often have a requirement for completion of projects to a certain time. So I found that I had to get an extension in time. I think the funding was for a 2-year period, but I missed a year because I needed to order plants. And I also needed, there was I think it was a dry season again. No, it was a wet season immediately after we had the floods, and I couldn't get in there to do the work. So contingencies for planning in time, as well as making sure that your seasonal work is set in place.
Sure, thank you. That was all the questions we had for you, and I think there's a few in the chat for Keith and Deirdre, but Keith looks like he's answered most of those. So I might hand, oh, hang on, there's one more here that snuck in just before I was about to hand over. What were the circumstances where direct seeding was deemed more appropriate than planting tube stock?
So it was a matter of me making a decision about going and getting some seed. I thought, I've got this money, seed is cheap. And so I went out and got a heap of seed. And then there were areas where we could get a bulldozer in and do a bit of ripping so that we could do some direct seeding. But there are some areas where there are heritage values from the mining landscape and also Indigenous heritage values where we couldn't get a ripper in. And so those were the areas that we used tube stock to plant, but also the community wanted to be involved, and so that was where it's easier to get them to have a day's worth of tree planting to get them involved. So it really doesn't matter, you can do either. It's a matter of practicalities and in this instance involving the community.
Yeah. So I guess a follow-on from that question would be what method do you think worked the best? Was there a quicker recovery or a better method that worked out more successful than the other?
Direct seeding always works better, especially when you have people who are unskilled at planting tube stock. If you have a day where you've got 1,000 trees put in the ground, it's really difficult to go back over them all and say, oh, there's 500 of them that haven't been planted well. So you can aim for 50% to 80% success rate with tube stock, but if you do it right for direct seeding, it all pops up.
Sure, thanks, Callum. I'll hand back over to Kate now, and we'll move on to the next presentation.
Thanks very much, Callum. That was fabulous. Just really good to hear about a more urban situation, but the lessons that you've learnt and the things that you put into place, how they could be applied elsewhere, was really interesting, and it's really great to see the benefits still being, I guess, experienced 11 years later. So our next presentation is, I'm really excited to hear this presentation, and I'd like to acknowledge one of our other collaborators, the East Gippsland Catchment Management Authority, who's been doing a power of work over in the east of the state. So we have a tag team today. We have Glenn Johnson from Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and Mel Burleson from the East Gippsland Catchment Management Authority, or CMA. They've collaborated on a really great project, and I know it's ongoing work over in Gippsland, but it's really great to hear about what they're doing. And it's focusing on a threatened species today, and the endangered spotted tree frog. So I'm going to hand over to them. They'll do a switcheroony possibly in the middle of their presentation. So they're speaking today about weed management in a remote catchment, protecting the critically endangered spotted tree frog in the Wongangarra. So over to you.
Yeah, g'day. Thanks very much, Kate. And yeah, it's great to be here, and it's a really interesting add-on to, or juxtaposition to, Callum's discussion, because we're really going at 180 degrees from that urban environment when we're looking at this particular remote catchment. So, this really builds on both Keith and Deirdre's earlier presentations, which demonstrates that there's a whole lot of thinking behind where works are undertaken. And in this instance, we're going to focus in on a particular remote catchment, which, as we know, presents its own opportunities and definitely some challenges. So I'm going to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm coming from today, which is Barranduda, which is southeast of Wodonga on the road to Yakandanda. And so I acknowledge the Dodoroa people and also pay respects to traditional owners, both working and living on country, and Aboriginal people that are here with us on this webinar. As Kate mentioned, the aim of today is to look at a threatened species, but really this is just a flagship for a whole suite of species and ecosystems, a community in a relatively intact environment. And so I'll be covering off on some of the threatened species component of it, and then I'll, as Kate mentioned, hand over to Mel, who look at the control of weeds in more detail. So I'm going to give an overview on the spotted tree frog, which I mentioned is a flagship, and I'll cover some other things. Just to put in context, the sausage, the grey sausages that are straddled across the Great Divide there represent some of the dozen or so locations in northeast Victoria where this species still occurs. And I say still occurs because it is a critically endangered and declining species. What's not shown on the map is another location in New South Wales, the only one really outside of Victoria, and that's in the Kosciuszko National Park, and we're very much in collaborating with the New South Wales authorities in the overall species recovery management and program. This species is a montane species, so this is a bit of a zoom up on the Wongangarra, and with a key being, in terms of reference point, it's a south-flowing stream south of the Hotham zone, and so Wongangarra flows in the Wongangarra into the Thompson out into the sea ultimately. And the unique feature of this, and as I mentioned before, very different to Callum's last presentation, this site is out of sight, out of view basically, and it therefore demonstrates some of those challenges and opportunities different to Callum's, where we really don't have a huge presence in the area, and therefore the potential for things to go undetected and untreated is high. And so Mel will be covering off more on the vagaries of how to do control in such a remote environment. It's nevertheless, these remote areas have potentially, and in this instance, got really high biodiversity values. And it's reflecting on the fact that we've got relatively little access into this area. And so as we know, particularly from a weeds, and as Keith mentioned, from a predator perspective, the lack of tracks and the lack of historical disturbance, such as timber harvesting, means that we've got a fighting chance that there's some intact systems in here. But it does represent that challenge that they go undetected and unseen, and then potentially untreated, as I mentioned. You might notice that there's the halo of the 220 fires in this area, which is missing out on the very top part of the catchment, but this area has been burnt. And I suppose the key thing that I want to next reflect on is that this is a view from Mount Murray into down the Blowfly Spur, which is a really significant spot in the catchment of the Wongagarra, and a view into the Wongagarra. And this is a view after the 214 fires. But it's had three significant fire events in the last 2 decades, which, as you all know, that there's the cumulative effects of fires. And one of the issues in terms of management for land managers in this area going into the future is that increasing tendency for intense fires, droughts, and the concerns and the challenges related to control of fire in this landscape. BBRR has been mentioned, so biodiversity, bushfire response and recovery. We managed to get into the Wongagarra and other spotted tree frog streams. This is in early March, straight after the fires were safe, and it was a view to do some reconnaissance to check on the status of the fire of the species, this particular asset in this area. And I'm not going to go hugely into detail in this, but suffice to say that the concern is the case right across the fire footprint from what we call the New Year's Eve fires in our part of the world, the fires that emanated from Walwa and also in our Ovens district, were not so much the fire, but the post-fire rain events, which generated huge amounts of sediment and ash. And that's critical with this species because the timing was really lousy in that it was just at the time when breeding events had occurred and eggs and tatties were in the stream and really got smashed. And so the recruitment from this past year had been really hammered. And when you combine that with an overlaid existing threat, so fire impacts compounding disease threats. So people may be familiar with an amphibian fungus, a thing called chytridomycosis or chytrid fungus. It's a really insidious thing that not only is affecting frog species in Australia, but right around the world, and it's particularly virulent on the spotted tree frog. And there's a whole lot of discussion and related management that we're looking into, even to the extent of trying to consider and putting ourselves in position with Zoos Vic and a number of other institutions for emergency, if you like, collection for captive breeding as insurance for insurance populations and a backup to give us some scope for management into the future. So having places like the Wongagarra is really critical for some of those potential future management objectives and ideas. So as I mentioned, this area, I could talk about spotted tree frogs, but really it's a flagship for a whole suite of species. So I've got a photo of the Gippsland crays, which are an awesome thing. They're in this crystal clear water, but this catchment is incredibly good for the large forest owls, for the greater and yellow-bellied gliders, for a whole suite of mammals and reptiles and amphibians. There's eastern water dragons, which reflect that it's one of the south-flowing streams. There's eel in these headwaters, and we might know the story of eels ending up going all the way down to the ocean and back. But the key thing from this being a biodiversity hotspot is that it's just quality intact vegetation, and one of the assets is its lack or relative absence of weeds. And Mel will show in a moment the dots, which look pretty significant in terms of the amount of weed cover in here, but really there's so little in here, and that's the key. That's the real thing of the challenge of how to maintain really high biodiversity intact areas and protect the best bits, which is really what we're trying to do. The key thing, which I'll do handstands and head flips over, is that this catchment does not have blackberries, and I'll go if there's a better catchment in northeast Victoria. It's the only one I know which is relatively, or it is absence of blackberry, which is an incredible thing. Quick one on spotted tree frogs and how they work. They love bouldery streams in rapidy situations, in montane riparian situations. They love basking on midstream boulders. And why do they do that? They generate heat, the boulders generate heat, and they hang in these situations well into the dark and feed on insects which come emerging in the nocturnal period. But the key thing, I suppose, from a weeds perspective is this beautiful environment is rocky and really prone in a normal instance to weed invasion. And I'll allude to some of the management challenges in a moment, but the potential for this being a really good habitat for frogs, spotted tree frogs in particular, is due to the large number of rocks, the midstream rocks, the solar orientation and the amount of sun that gets into these areas, and the fact that there's really good native vegetation and a great insect source for the frogs. And so these sort of environments in the absence of willows are fantastic, but as we know, willows really have a great capacity to colonise into these areas. And so what's the connection? What's the threat of willows? They can, as we know, colonise and outcompete and shade these very areas which are critical for spotted tree frog. And Mel will have some further notes and demonstration of, and we're probably all familiar with when willow gets out of control and can just totally smother an area. So the inside edges of shingle banks, midstream islands, they're all the colonisation points for things like lots of seedlings. I'm just going to show some of the challenges of remote environments. So really difficult to get to, really difficult to control locations, and Mel will expand on that further. And just the regenerative potential of small seedling willows that can generate, in this instance, probably not going to go too far on these bonsai rock situations, but we know that they've got capacity to really expand, and particularly where there's mature species and they sucker from branches falling off, etc. My last slide is to acknowledge the partnerships and the collaborations, has been mentioned also with Deirdre and Keith and Callum. It is really critical, and as Callum reflected, there's perhaps there's not the landholders, there's not the small urban groups to be involved in here, but there is really important collaborations, and particularly in terms of fire and just the management of fire in a remote catchment. We deliberately plan in an IMT that Keith mentioned earlier. When there's a fire happening in these remote areas, we want to protect them from fire, but we want to preserve the integrity of these sites. We deliberately don't put new dozer lines, containment lines into these areas because we know they are vectors for spreads of weeds. They open up opportunities for predators, as Keith mentioned also. So forest fire management, our joined up agencies with PV and DELP are very conscious of things like not using FOS-check because of the aquatic species in the drink, but using FOS-check to manage fire down a slope and prevent it getting into the headboard, into the main areas of fire. Science is a really important part about, and science and monitoring is really important, and Mel will reflect on that in terms of, I think the key thing we need to keep in mind is what are our assets and how are they coping post-fire, and how are they coping, and are they how effective are the treatments? And so we've done a lot of work and still continue to do work with Melbourne Uni and threatened species hubs, etc., with maintaining our knowledge and understanding the asset that we've got in this environment. So I'm going to finish sharing that one, and then I'll just open it up now for Mel to commence on her presentation. Okay, and is that one up and viewing now?
Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, I can see that perfectly. Hi everyone, I'm Mel Burleson. I work for the East Gippsland CMA. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm presenting on today, the Gunai-Kurnai people, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and any other elders that might be watching today. Just a little bit about me. My role with the CMA is a project coordinator. I've been doing on-ground delivery programs for the last 8 years across all of East Gippsland. I'm currently coordinating the delivery of all our bushfire recovery control programs, our weed control, and that's across all funding sources. This has meant lots of collaboration and engagement with other stakeholders, and that's been a really important aspect of this. But lots of the work that we're going to talk about today is the collaboration of on-ground activities and that importance of sharing information. So this here, so the CMA have got an upcoming project that will be delivered in early 2021. This has been funded by DELP Water and Catchments, a part of the bushfire recovery. It's going to see extensive weed control programs right across the East Gippsland fire affected footprint. Now, the project that I'm going to talk about in particular, and this is important to Glenn, is the 65 k's of the Wongangarra River and the 17 kilometres of the Selwyn Creek, which flows into the top of the Wongangarra River. These are going to be walked and treated for woody weeds by our contractors. We're looking primarily for willows, cineraria, which is a shrub-type willow, and English broom. Now, they're priority species for the CMA, and we know that there are infestations across the Dargo High Plains, the surrounding plains, and we've been in and treated that before. As depicted here, the January 2020 fires, they impacted a large portion of this river, and it was particularly hot from Blue Rag to Sarah Spur. So that's below where the frog species are generally found, but it's something that we need to keep in mind when we're sending contractors into this area. There are little opportunities for contractors to access the river in the headwater area up the top, making this type of work really challenging and remote, and little opportunity for contractors to walk out. So this is the full length of the Wongangarra here. As you can see in the map, it's highlighted in the left-hand corner, but this just shows the intensity of the fire. So the darker the red, the darker the fire. Some of you may be familiar with this, but I've just overlapped just so you can see what sort of conditions that the contractors are actually going to walk in. And I've also highlighted that the start point and the end point, and there's only really three particular access points the contractors can walk out at. So it is a quite substantial distance once we've got the contractors in there. So this project came about, so we'd had a previous program down the Wongangarra undertaking weed control in about 2015, and I came across Glenn at that particular time. So we were intending to do willow work then, and I made contact with Glenn, and he discussed the importance of the critically endangered spotted tree frog. So this time round, through the collaborative fire recovery planning sessions that we've had with Parks and DELP, so as well as our internal meetings we've had for different fire recovery funding sources, we've also had external discussions interagency just to make sure that we're all across the same page and we're all working in different areas. So it was through those discussions we'd identified, so DELP and Parks both identified this was a priority area for them for different reasons. So we discussed the nature of the works we wanted to complete, what we're all hoping to achieve, and it was through those discussions we decided that EGCMA, the CMA, were best placed to complete the works. So that allowed DELP and Parks the opportunity to go and spend some of their funding in other areas, which was great for the environment, great for other species. So that's how this came about. So in 2015, we had an extensive upper catchment project, as you can see on this map on the left-hand side here. So we completed the weed control in the Wongangarra, in Selwyn Creek, in Crooked River, and the Frosty Creek. So they're all remote headwater systems in the top of the Mitchell catchment. They're really hard to get into, not very easily accessible, and quite challenging. And they were also quite heavily fire affected at that time from the 2014-15 fires. So this time round, we saw the Wongangarra as a priority to be done again in 2021 after the recent fires, as we generally like to go back and do maintenance once every 4 years, just if we've got funding to do it. So this is mainly because of the seeding properties of willows and their ability to disperse across the landscape. So the seed pod has been known to travel up to 60 k's from its source. This is both upstream within the valley floor and across ridgelines into neighbouring valleys. So seed travels far, and that's why even these remote systems need to be done on a regular basis just to ensure that there's no new infestations. This photo is from 2015, and as you can see, there's been previous bushfires within the landscape. So this was from the fire where over 8,000 hectares burned at the top of the catchment. This is leading into the Wangangara. So one of our contractors actually took this when he was walking in to complete the Wangangara in 2015. Every one of those green dots represent where the cinerea was found. So cinerea is also known as a grey sallow willow. And these all represent what was found after the 2015 fires. The large distribution along the top, which was pretty much continual from the top down for the first 20 k's. Now, when we did that pass, mainly these willows that we found in there were juveniles. There were a couple of mature plants, but most of these dots just represent juvenile willows. So this here is just a bit of a close-up. So this is the area that's greatest concern for Glenn and the spotted tree frog, and this is where his work focuses. So it's really important that we're collaborating and sharing what we find with Glenn and his team. So cinerea, which is the shrub willow, thrives in wet, moist environments, and though its seeding properties have been known to colonise quickly, this is something that can impact on the frogs if no one gets in and does the work. So as these pictures show, these plants are at a variety of age classes, with mature and juvenile plants being found in some areas. But when we went in 2015, there was also carpets of seedlings within the valley floor. So fire affected and heavily fire affected, and just, yeah, willows absolutely everywhere. But some of them are only a few centimetres high, which was quite challenging for contractors to find. So the top left-hand picture just shows there that what a gully full of multi-stem cinerea had taken over the drainage line heading into the Wangangara. So that itself wasn't actually the Wangangara River, that was a drainage line off the Wangangara. And at this particular time, we had contractors go in and treat not only the main stem, but walk up every gully and tributary just to ensure that with those moist environments, there were no weeds and willows growing up there as well. So this was treated, and it's something we look out for when we go into the field. We make sure that we scope everywhere we can. We don't just treat everything that's in the willow, everything along the river, sorry. We go up drainage lines, tributaries, gullies as well, just to have a look. So the second picture was just to show that cinerea, it doesn't matter where it grows, it'll grow anywhere. So left untreated, as Glenn said, this will kind of block the main channel, forcing water to go elsewhere, choose an alternate path, and that have implications on both the flora and fauna. So just a few more pictures of what was found in the Wangangara in 2015. So I've circled them in red just so you can see where those infestations are. So again, there's cinerea willow. So the riparian areas that were not burnt had big mature trees that need to be dealt with. So there wasn't a lot of them, but these gullies had a few in them. Prior to this, the authority hadn't been in for 3 years beforehand. So if you count the rings on the cinerea stump pictured here, you can see there are 3 or 4 highly visible rings. So that indicates that was a willow that we potentially missed last time we went in. It was probably in its infancy. It was probably only a couple of centimetres, and contractors had walked past that last time we went in. So this kind of highlights that we need to go in regularly, and we need to keep doing this stuff to ensure that these don't grow to a substantial size. That was taken, that picture of the stump itself was taken from one of the trees in the other photo. So it just puts it into perspective how big willows can grow, and given the right conditions, how quickly they can take over some ecosystems. So this picture here, as you can see, the red arrows again, it's not spot the willow in this one. You can see willows absolutely everywhere. So this was taken in a remote section of the Wangangara, a little bit lower down than Blue Rag, but you can see that willows have absolutely colonised everything within this photo. So the CMA, we take a top-down approach for our woody weed control. getting into the remote terrain is often quite difficult and quite challenging, and it definitely takes a certain kind of contractor to put in these situations and a particular skill set to complete these works. If agencies don't collaborate and don't work together to maximise funding opportunities, these pristine areas would look very different if we didn't get in there. So if this was upstream and we didn't treat it, it could potentially become a big issue for the frog. So this is a bit of an example. Although there are willows, and I did spot these after, and I have circled those again, this is an example of what a healthy headwater system looks like. So the willows actually do affect river health and stream bank stability. It does it by crowding out native species. It spreads large root networks into the water, can take up large amounts of water, and eventually diverting the natural flow. The annual leaf autumn drop can also affect water quality by increasing organic matter and nutrient levels, and it can also change the available habitat and refuge for species such as frogs. So I know when Keith was talking, he did say that sometimes weeds post-fire are good for habitat for frogs, and that's something that I think we need to consider probably into the future as well. But as you can see, yeah, there's a few willows popping up on the left, and we need to ensure we get in and treat those now just to make sure it stays pristine like the photo on the right. So this is a good example in comparison to what we're expecting to find when we go into the Wangangara this time around. This is Frosty Creek. So this was taken in 2018, post the 2014 fires. So this was a few years after the last lot of fires that have gone through there, and that picture depicts how the willows can colonise systems. So in this instance, the willows within Frosty Creek were pretty much found from valley floor to valley floor, and it was highly intensive effort to treat both physically and cost-wise. So this was a really, really expensive exercise in a very remote system where we had contractors come down. They got to this point and they just didn't have enough supplies, didn't have enough chemical or resources to stay in there and treat. So we've gone back in since and treated that. So it was about 3 k's of river that looked like this. So even though it was in the middle of nowhere, it was really, really important for us to get in and do it. It's equally as important as working on a floodplain, just getting in and making sure these don't spread further downstream. So this picture, so after the 2020 fires, you can see here that there was pretty much a full canopy burn in the riparian area. So this is a gully leading down into the Wangangara, and it's very similar to the picture that was shown earlier going into the Wangangara. But this is what Frosty Creek looked like after the 2020 burn. And I'm using this as an example because this is what we're anticipating when we go into the Wangangara. So these are recently, the contractors went in for us not long ago. So this was after the 2020 fire. Again, you can see even down in the riparian area, all the canopy was burnt. Native grasses and willows have responded. You can see on the left-hand side there are some grasses coming back up, and in between that there are willows growing as well, and that's what the contractors here are working on. So those native grasses are really essential for habitat for the smaller critters, the frogs, and 6 months after fires they seem to be the optimal time to get in. They're not of a great height, and a really good time to get in just to ensure that they're not out competing that native vegetation. So these next 2 slides are just examples of what we found in Frosty Creek and what we think we're going to face in the Wangangara. So lots of juvenile growth within the understory, as you can see here. So although the canopies have been fully burnt, you can see that the willows are well and truly full. They're alive and they're resprouting. As I said, it hasn't been a great deal of time between the fires and this, only 6 months, but it'll just become a carpet if we don't leave it. Here's another couple of pictures. As you can see here, quite multi-stemmed, quite dense for willows. And you can see the catkins on the other one. So those catkins, one seed pod can produce a multitude of plants if left. If the conditions are right, that seed can travel. So it's really important to get in and treat. So I've put this picture in just to show you what the contractors face when we send them into these remote locations. It's not easy work. It's physically and mentally challenging. It definitely takes a certain kind of skill set to send contractors in there. I just want to say thanks to one of our contractors, GCAPS, for the photos and the data from this presentation. So this is why we need a specific type of contractor to go into this remote sort of work. Contractors in the remote locations walk in at one end and they walk out at the other. So they don't have cars. So generally they walk in, they walk out. They don't have vehicles. They can be walking anywhere from 5 to 15 k's a day, which day in, day out, that is quite challenging. It's rocky, it's mountainous, and there's fire affected debris on the ground. So it's quite tough. So generally they go in between 5 and 10 days, depending on where the access points are. If they come across a lot of willows while they're in there, it presents even more challenges, like the ones in Frosty Creek. So they need to ration for the walkout. They need to make sure they've got enough chemical, and they need to make sure they've got enough food, because they only carry one pack in, and that's it. There are no refuel stops. It's walk in, walk out. They camp where they stop for the night, like this, on rocks. It's only they only camp in the cleared areas that they can. So sometimes if they're in a valley, a mountainous valley, they don't have any chances to camp anywhere else. So yeah, can't imagine it'd be too comfortable sleeping on rocks like this. So if something goes wrong in these areas, the only way really to get our contractors out is to helicopter them out, which we haven't had to do in my time at the CMA. So the contractors we send into these locations definitely have to have really good OHS systems in place in case anything arises. They have to have a really good two-way communication devices, which we can locate them on at any given time, and they must be able to respond to our communications, which we have had to use in the past. Last time the boys went into Frosty Creek, there was actually fire started, and it was fantastic. We could actually notify them and let them know, and at that point in time they were walking out. So just to ensure though that they knew there was a fire in the area and they were going to be safe. So all our contractors have sat phones, EPIRBs in case of emergencies, and all crew members are proficient in first aid. They're competent at treating willows and woody weeds. But the one important thing is we don't just send people into this area and we don't expect them to do this kind of work. We actually test them out on semi-remote systems where there's road access, but just as challenging conditions before we'd send anyone into something like this. So it's important for the CMA to talk to agencies like Parks and DELP and let them know that our contractors are working in the area in case there are fires or other on-ground activities which may arise and impact on our contractor safety. And that's why collaboration and information sharing across all levels from management to on-ground staff is really, really important, and something I think most of our agencies do really well. So the collaboration doesn't end when we have completed a project either. So we create maps highlighting weed infestations treated and the species targeted, and we share this information with land managers, other identified interested stakeholders, traditional owners, adjacent landholders, local agency staff. Pretty much anyone that wants this information, we're happy to share. So we read all our contractor reports and pass on any information relevant to other agencies, and that includes any weed species that are not targeted but may be of interest to the land manager, any significant flora or fauna, and any features identified while undertaking the project. So with this fire recovery project, we've had requests from an agency to map any deer wallows and things like that we may come across in some of these remote systems, so they can use that information to plan their future programs. So we've got our contractors capturing that in some of those headwater systems as well. So we make sure we share all our photos and discuss the outcomes of the projects with land managers. And when we start a new project, we pretty much repeat the process. We make sure we engage early in the planning, and in the past, this has seen us change what we are doing as other agencies are doing the same thing. So we've had some crossover, and it's where those planning meetings are really, really important. So we know if one person's doing it, it's getting covered, and we can use our money to go and spend somewhere else, which is fantastic. So just in closing, really the most valuable, important thing really is that we need to engage with other agencies. We need to make sure we're incorporating into the planning phase and on completion, so they know what we're doing and we know what they're doing. But knowing that Glenn is really passionate about the frogs and maintaining that environment, and Glenn knowing that we're going to get in there and treat willows, I think is a really, really good thing. And into the future, I think that will help protect those spotted tree frog populations. Glenn, have you got anything else to say?
No, I'm happy that you've covered things really well, Mel, and just shows the importance and shows the hassles of getting into an area and the special nature of working in such an environment, but it really also demonstrates the critical importance of protecting such high biodiversity value areas. Even though it's hard to do, it's so significantly important to do so.
Yeah, it definitely is, and it's quite challenging, but it's very rewarding, and just ensuring that we go back and keep maintaining, I think that's a really good thing, and the data we're capturing shows that the more we go back and the more we have a regular cycle, the better off we are.
All right, thanks both. What I don't envy those contractors at all, but what a great example of different agencies collaborating together to protect a really important environment. We've got time just for one question. We're wondering if the weed mapping data that you collect, Mel, does that go into the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas as well, or where does that data then get collected and inputted to?
So that data, up until now, we've been really capturing willow data, but with this fire recovery stuff, we've created a new data set. We're going to map all the weeds that we come across in the fire affected areas. At this point in time, that information, I haven't thought about where that's going to go. I'm just capturing that to be able to share with anyone that may want that information. We've got, I think, 32 different systems we're going to treat fire affected areas. So I'm happy to share that information with anyone as it comes in at the end. I'm going to make one data set. If anyone wants it, happy to share that at the end.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll hand back to Kate.
Thanks, Bianca. Wow, what a presentation! Just a stunning landscape, and it's amazing to see the kind of country that those contractors are working in, and just the contrast between Callum's presentation before is so stark. The different environments that we're working in with fire and weeds. It's been fascinating to hear those stories today. So thank you very much. Thank you to all our speakers today and the audience for joining us, and our support team. Thanks, Matt, for helping us with tech today, and to all our collaborators. I just take this opportunity to mention a few more of our collaborators for the series. The Gunai Karnai Land and Waters Aboriginal Corporation, GLAWAC, Regional Roads Victoria, and Department of Jobs Precincts and Regions, DJPR. Thank you all for helping us with this webinar series. Now, working on invasive species and fire management, especially at this time, can be overwhelming. We hope that you've connected with some like-minded people today and extended your network just by seeing who's in the chat and so on through the list of participants and also through the speakers. But if you need additional support, we encourage you to contact your agency support service or Lifeline, Beyond Blue, or other services. Really important to do that. Social media is a great way to stay connected. Both Bianca and I are active on social media, and there are lots of invasive species groups now, particularly on Facebook, but lots of people active on Instagram and Twitter, just some of the social media platforms that are in use for weed and invasive species and fire management. So if you're tagging us today, hashtag #WeedFireWebinars would be great. We'd love to see your posts. And also just a reminder that we have an evaluation form. We want to know what we can do to make each webinar better than the last, and also just to see what you're thinking about the series. So the recordings for this webinar should be on the Swift website very soon, and also the links from the chat and so on will also be on the Swift website. We have a newsletter about early invader weeds. We'll put the link in the chat if you'd like to subscribe to that. And a reminder that there is one more webinar in the series next Wednesday, and it's all about weed identification and recording. And Bianca and I will both be speaking at the webinar next week. So we've got lots of work still to do. We encourage you to register for that webinar if you haven't. It's going to be terrific. There's some other really great speakers. So from Bianca Gold and myself and our collaborators, we'd like to thank you for joining us today, and stay safe, and we hope to see you next Wednesday. Thank you very much.